To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Really horrible stuff, but that sort of makes material a lot of the things that you're talking about in this book, because we're talking about insecurity, not just in terms of like financial insecurity, material insecurity, but like writ large, pretty broadly. This is a lens that's supposed to be, I think, very malleable and usable in a way to kind of look at, the misallocated distribution and provisioning of resources globally that we live with, not necessarily through the lens of inequality or focusing on the kind of statistical distribution of those things, but of a more like sort of tangible sense of like what it feels like to live in our political economy. And I think insecurity is such a great way of trying to frame that, especially considering how many things in capitalism we sort of frame under this like idea of securitization, whether that's like health insurance or a mortgage or going to college and taking on debt to go to college. And I think what's really cool about what you've done with this is that it's a book that's about economics that again kind of refuses that actuarial regime of power that's so easy to tap into when you're talking about the economy. You forego these like statistical comparisons for this more like emotional and personal way of thinking about and talking about how we all relate to the economy and each other. And I feel like this was probably really inspired by your work in Debt Collective. So I hope that we get a chance to get into some deeper discussion of that work too. But for folks who haven't read the book or heard the lectures yet, can you briefly touch on your main argument in Age of Insecurity and what you hoped this project could offer readers? Because I think you really effectively and compassionately challenge readers and listeners to not take for granted their current relationship to work and capitalism, to recognize that what makes us feel insecure in our lives is a combination of things that we can't control and things that we can, but pretend that we can't. And it feels like a really accessible way to try and start a conversation that tries to get to the root of really, I guess, how capitalism kind of reproduces itself and its own hegemony.
Yeah, so much good stuff in there. And I'll try to be concise so we can dig into whatever sub-issues you're most interested in. But, it's fun to be on a boldly left-wing podcast where we can say things like health communism. But, I also wrote these lectures knowing they'd be broadcast by the CBC and that I'd be reaching folks who maybe need to be persuaded to think more critically about capitalism and possible alternatives. So the framework of insecurity, I think, is actually a powerful one to reach people, and one that the left should utilize more. So this book both rethinks the sources of our insecurity and also, what security could look like, and why that's actually a really important horizon for people. So certainly, I think I have an abiding interest in finance. That's part of what actually drew me to the Debt Collective. Part of it was my own indebtedness and the fact that I was suffering through a pretty serious default at the time. But I'm also just interested in how power works, and power works through economics. I was very interested in political economy, and there's, just part of me that refuses to sort of reify the economic realm and separate it from the social, the political, and the emotional, right? Because that's the move that, the sort of economic status quo is always trying to do, right? Well, this is just statistics and math and, economic laws that we've made up and are now saying are eternal. And I think that's bogus, right? We as leftists are saying, no, actually, you can't separate the political and economic spheres. And then when I'm saying that, right? And also the affective spheres, like, economics is actually tied so deeply into the fabric of our day-to-day lives. Finance is actually it actually relates very deeply to your feelings. Economic issues are always also emotional issues. And so this book certainly reflects, that perspective on the world. So with this book, I'm trying to say that the way we feel under capitalism today is a consequence of the fact that this economic paradigm runs on insecurity. And that insecurity is not just a sort of unfortunate byproduct of a competitive economic system, but actually a core product of it. So capitalism, yes, relentlessly drives the accumulation of wealth, of capital. But in order to do that, we have to be made insecure. So, one thing the lectures do is sort of retell the history of capitalism, hopefully concisely and entertainingly, but with an emphasis on the way that insecurity was actually essential to that transition from feudalism to capitalism. That, when what's called the enclosure movement happened, when peasants were sort of kicked off the common lands in feudal England, and this was like, a long process that happened through thousands of acts of parliament. What was really happening there was, in order for the peasants who subsisted through agriculture to be made into the proletariat, they had to be made insecure, to be literally severed from their land and livelihood. And so capitalism begins with what I call the manufacture of insecurity. And so the book sort of examines that process and how it's playing out in the modern day. And my point in doing this is that, again, I think it's a useful framework for the present because it's one that allows us to transcend that purely statistical mode you were talking about, right? So insecurity is a personal and a political phenomenon. You feel insecure because you're being made insecure by design. And I think that that's something that, can connect with a lot of people, which ultimately is what I'm all about. That's why I'm an organizer, right? You're trying to find frameworks that people can see themselves in, understand their predicaments in, and that point a way forward to collective action.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. You'll get access to this and the rest of our catalog of patron-only episodes, and be the first to get a new patron episode every Monday when it drops. With love, the Death Panel.